This video is going to take a lot of coffee. We've talked about many theories and practicalities on this channel about Evangelion, from why Eva ended happily, various facts, sequel theories, or Rey's first appearance in quantum mechanics, but there's always one question that seems to be requested, unanswered and completely avoided by myself, up until now. The explanation for the final scene in Evangelion and why Shinji strangled Asuka. The very idea of explaining the final scenes of Evangelion is, in its entirety, is something that I tried to elude from for a while because of its sheer complexity. So, if I can ask anything from the viewer, it's to sit through the entire video. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important and complicated questions to ask about Evangelion. So don't expect a short or concise answer that explains it all. One of the things that make Evangelion such a masterpiece is the fact that it's riddled with philosophical and poetic implementations, understood by those who take the time to decipher it. It's sort of esoteric in a way that its complexity is hard to grasp, but it's appreciated once understood. Part of the fun is learning, so don't sweat it if it doesn't come together all at once. Before we get started, I have a video titled Understanding Evangelion that goes into detail about basically the entire Eva timeline. So it's not necessarily essential for the sake of this video, but it may help because I'll briefly touch on the ending concepts and explain instrumentality and Shinji's will in this video before delving into the complex bits. And just like in Eva, nothing I talk about is going to be arbitrary. It's all information that's relevant. So it's advisable, if you do want to truly make sense of it all, to not skip ahead. To begin, there are many schools of thought or theories of the ending, and some of them are fan-made or speculation, while others are grounded by official Gainax illustrations and descriptions. We'll be looking at two different sort of sources for this video. The final scene explained officially by Gainax, although it very vaguely, as well as a philosophical breakdown of the behavior presented in the end of Eva. These two correspond together almost perfectly, and give the most accurate explanation of the reasonings behind the ending. And I'll give it my best shot to explain the philosophy and complexity behind both of them as best as I can. If you're not already wondering what the most official Gainax explanation is, it's held within the Bandai Evangelion movie series trading card game. Essentially a card game with several illustrations and descriptions, giving more light on different things that happen in Evangelion, including the ending. The other source of evidence we'll be looking at is from Hegel's Master-Slave essay from his renowned work in Phenomenology of Spirit. More specifically from paragraphs 178 and onward. I left the book in the description if you want to look at it, with a few other sources as well. Hegel is essential to understanding Evangelion, as Freud is paramount to understanding psychology. First, we're going to look at instrumentality and what it was. Before going any further, instrumentality can be compared to something like the Buddhist idea of oneness, the whole notion of leaving your identity behind and becoming one with all. The Human Instrumentality Project, put simply, was to devolve all humans, or any sentient beings for that matter, and put them back into a singular state. This singular state that's described as in Evangelion as LCL, or primordial soup. As it's known, after the impact, if instrumentality prevails, all life will be one. No pain, no sorrow, no sadness will be prevalent in the world. Shinji being the one who has sort of the deciding factor whether or not this happens, and he ultimately rejects human instrumentality for reasons that we'll address later on. That's all I'm briefly going to touch on in regards to exactly what instrumentality is, and if you do want any more information about the details, check out something like Understanding Evangelion or Happily Eva After. So, despite rejecting human instrumentality, Shinji rejoins Asuka and proceeds to strangle her. This might seem sort of strange for anyone who has the impression that the ending was, quote, happy or positive, which it was. The entire message of Evangelion was about hope or about the blissful endeavors of life. This might seem sort of bizarre, finding and accepting yourself. You may question my sincerity right now, but soon it'll make sense. There is a trading card game, and one card in particular that vaguely clarified the last scene. Drama card D88, Kimochi Waru, which is also what Asuka says at the end in Japanese. English translation would be something along the lines of disgusting or I feel sick. The small print reads the following. Shinji announces to the world, where all hearts had melted into one, and accepted each other unconditionally. His desire to live with others, other hearts that would sometimes reject him, even deny him. That is why the first thing he did, after coming to his senses, was place his hands around Asuka's neck, to feel the existence of another, to confirm, to make sure of rejection and denial. Okay, so to put simply, Shinji rejected human instrumentality, and because the world was an apocalyptic mess of ruins and LCL, he needed to verify to himself that the world he was living in abides by no rules of instrumentality. So, like mentioned before, the world was was bound by sorrow and pain and insecurities, all that jazz. So all that stuff was still present. That is why he did that one last terrible thing before the movie ended, to verify to himself that this was actuality, that he was living in the world he had chosen by rejecting human instrumentality. If we analyze this, it makes sense. Shinji fundamentally needed another person to confirm his existence, because if he were alone, it would be impossible to verify his existence of rejection. Two people are basically required to, with certainty, know or confirm oneself. This idea of needing people or entities goes flawlessly with Hegel's philosophy. This card's definition is acceptable, but the answer explained with philosophy gives a more discrete clarity of what actually happened before the movie ended. The sort of somatic elucidations seem irrelevant until we look at the philosophy of what Evangelion or what Anno himself is trying to portray. So let's talk about philosophy, shall we?
Philosophy, huh? Philosophy, huh?
I'll give you a rundown of what Hegel's philosophical work discusses in terms of the concepts of consciousness and mind, and how it just so happens to intentionally relate fittingly with Evangelion. The slave and master, or bondsman and servant sections of Hegel's book is a relevant, interesting read, and doesn't actually talk about slavery or what have you, but the social and conscious connections between two individuals of different standings in a psychological manner. Hegel claims that in the beginning, consciousness is not self-aware, but originally in a state of nothingness, much like what Evangelion calls instrumentality. When a consciousness becomes aware, it conflicts with other consciousness. The two are required to reconcile with each other, fighting to prove their existence by negating one another. The proof is being the other's conscious recognition, going back to the last scene where this combative behavior is a test to confirm one's existence. Not only that, but this is a test, but also a demonstration of how Asuka and Shinji need each other in so many fundamental ways. Hegel expresses these notions of self-consciousness a step further and asserts the subject as also an object to another subject. Self-consciousness being sort of a paradox of awareness, of another's awareness of itself. Let me explain. Hegel goes on to say that recognition of self-consciousness is really a struggle of recognition between two entities bound by one another, as unequal in a relationship of dependence. The master and slave description works accordingly here. So, for instance, the slave is dependent on the master because he is aware that the master sees him as nothing more than an object, rather than a subject. The master asserts his pure self-consciousness. He is stuck in a position of reflection of otherness. The master, on the other hand, is able to negate this otherness that he finds reflected through his slave, only because the slave to him does not appear to be conscious in his eyes. A good amount of psychoanalysts and existentialists agree with Hegel's notions. That whole notion of the subject is only aware of itself as being recognized by the eyes of another. This concept is, when put in example in Evangelion, makes more sense. Shinji and Asuka recognize each other through this negation to be two fully realized people. In a sense, both of them learn and accept each other this way. I earlier mentioned how instrumentality is a form of oneness with all. But at this conceptual level, if everything was turned into one, this would be the closest thing to nothingness as it comes. Nothing is then in turn more alone than being a single unaware consciousness. So, while the benefits of instrumentality bringing everyone together is not necessarily void, the perspective of the matter can be argued as solving nothing, attempting to solve an enormous problem by eliminating everything that can cause it. Shinji realizes this, and that is the basis of him rejecting instrumentality. I know it could be difficult to interpret such dramatically abstract concepts, but Anno's illustrations and dialogue among the characters further solidifies these accusations, that Anno's inspiration to Hegel's philosophy goes well beyond just conceptual theory. For instance, the show's last episode looks crude and unfinished, mainly because it's actually crude and unfinished due to budget constraints. But the fact is, the movies were taking place in the physical world, while the last moments of the show were actually inside of Shinji's subconscious. This is interesting to note because the art at these times becomes minimalistic and starts to lose its integrity, its entirety. Much like how Shinji is falling into the nothingness that is instrumentality, Shinji is stuck in a state of limbo, becoming absorbed by instrumentality, and at this time we see the background fade to white and him himself turn to more of an outline. And around the time Shinji rejects instrumentality, we see him regain his regular form and leave this sort of white abyss. The questions Shinji asks himself through this sort of transition phase shows that he's skeptical of instrumentality. He asks himself, what is this, a world of nothing? A world with nobody in it? This is a world with perfect freedom. Perfect freedom being nothing more than an abstract concept, meaning that consciousness is not being limited by general awareness. The concept of conscious will to perceive is eventually what makes Shinji's will to live on in the actual world. Shinji expresses these thoughts clearly when he says, but with only myself I have nothing to interact with. This is as if I'm here, but not here at all. This is as if I'm slowly fading out of existence. This is Shinji's sort of last realization. We sometime later hear dialogue from Asuka and Rei that tell the following to Shinji. Your self-image is restricted by having observed the barriers between yourself and others, and yet you can't see yourself without the presence of others. This piece of dialogue seemingly links with Hegel's knowledge of self-consciousness perfectly. For Hegel, you're only self-aware through the recognition of others. On a conscious level, Shinji comes to understand this when he says, because there are others I can perceive myself as an individual. If I'm alone, I will be the same as without others. Which Misato replies with, by recognizing the differences between yourself and others, you establish identity as yourself.
But are you really sure that the perceptions of others form my true self?
It's true, Shinji Ikari.
Has it taken you this long to realize that? What an idiot!
The scene where Shinji and Asuka lay on a barren white beach is symbolism of two conscious entities about to prove to each other their worth. You are only self-aware through the recognition of others, the perception of others of you. This is the master and slave reenactment with Shinji and Asuka. The combative nature of this fight is what determines self-consciousness. Shinji must feel pain, fear, and struggle in order to know that he is self-conscious. The moment Shinji chokes Asuka gives rise to self-consciousness. Once he realizes instrumentality was rejected and that he was back. Back might not necessarily be the best way of describing it, but more like reborn in terms of consciousness. You see, both Shinji and Asuka are very similar in the sense that both of their flaws are a direct result of never receiving unconditional love from their parents. Both of them exhibit similar flaws in the sense that they aren't used to love, or they're not used to being liked by others, and never learned to deal with how others felt about them. Shinji and Asuka never got this reassurance as children and ultimately developed their flaws. Shinji and Asuka are metaphysically the same, and their relationship is one of love and hate. Asuka tells Shinji that she hates him because he reminds her so much of herself. So basically, if you're one to say that you hate Shinji, you're just rejecting yourself. Disgusting. On a side note, like Shinji being in a state of limbo where he was conforming to the oneness of the world we mentioned, he would have embraced all the flaws as a single being. This would have been the fate of all humans if had instrumentality prevailed. This is also how Asuka knows about the shameful thing that Shinji did to her comatose body before the impact, explaining why the first thing that she said to him once they reunited was, disgusting. This metaphorical battle I mentioned before, where the consciousness combat each other, is what Shinji and Asuka did at the end. But, like the master and slave conflict, the fight is not one-sided, and Shinji and Asuka alternate between proving dominance. Shinji strangles Asuka, and she replies with a comforting, motherly caress across his face, submitting before him until she alternates the situation around on him, calling him out and saying her final line, disgusting, where it's Shinji who submits and falls to tears, realizing instrumentality had failed. This exchange of switching roles in a way is demonstration of them learning and understanding each other. Again, their sort of special love and hate relationship. But more than love, the movie expresses the enjoyments that hope can offer. The hope is translated into Shinji's will, this will to proceed through life despite the hardships, the will to return from instrumentality, the will to understand oneself through others. This is the message of Evangelion.